There is a kind of man who walks alone, not because he's lost, but because he's found something too rare to follow the crowd. A man who chooses silence over noise, purpose over popularity, and discipline over distraction. Today, I'm not here to talk about the comfort of the crowd or the applause of the world. I'm here to talk about the strength that's built in solitude. About the kind of strength that doesn't shout, but endures. About the man who walks a lonely path, not out of weakness, but because his vision demands it. This is for the chosen. The few who understand that walking alone isn't a punishment, it's a preparation. And that in the silence, greatness is forged. There is a profound and often underestimated power in being alone. In a world that glorifies constant connection, endless interaction, and external validation, solitude can feel like a punishment or a sign of weakness. But for the chosen few who dare to walk a different path, solitude is not isolation. It is a sanctuary. It is the forge where identity is refined, where the noise of the world falls away, and where a man can finally hear the sound of his own purpose. Walking alone doesn't mean walking aimlessly, it means walking with such inner conviction that you no longer need direction from the crowd. When you are alone, there is no one left to impress, no masks to wear, no roles to play, no expectations to fulfill. All that remains is the raw, unfiltered version of who you are, and that is where the work begins. You begin to confront your doubts, your insecurities, your fears, and your flaws. You begin to see not who the world told you to be, but who you really are. And in that confrontation, identity takes shape. It isn't gifted to you by society, it is carved out of silence, struggle, and stillness. Solitude reveals the real you, not the curated version, not the social media persona, not the echo of other people's opinions, but the authentic self that only emerges when the noise is gone. Most people are terrified of that silence. They fill every moment with distraction, every quiet space with stimulation, and every pause with noise because silence forces self-reflection, and self-reflection is uncomfortable. It means facing truths you've avoided and questions you've ignored. But if you can sit in that discomfort and allow it to teach you, you begin to grow in ways that comfort could never offer. That's the paradox of solitude. It feels like a retreat, but it's actually an advance. It looks like stillness, but it's deep motion. It seems quiet, but inside there's a roaring transformation taking place. Walking alone gives you perspective. It pulls you back from the chaos and lets you observe the world without being absorbed by it. When you're surrounded by people, it's easy to adopt their values, mimic their behaviors, chase their goals. But when you step away, you get to ask yourself, what do I actually believe? What do I truly want? What matters to me when no one else is watching? These are questions that only solitude can answer, and the answers don't come quickly. They come in fragments, in quiet mornings, long walks, late nights, and moments of honest solitude. They arrive when you've had time to peel back the layers and look beneath the surface of your own life. Solitude is also where resilience is born. When you walk alone, you don't have the crutch of constant support. You don't have someone to lean on in every moment of weakness. And because of that, you learn to stand on your own. You learn to motivate yourself, to correct yourself, to carry yourself forward without applause or encouragement. And in doing so, you become unshakable, because a man who knows how to stand alone is a man who cannot be manipulated by fear, rejection, or loneliness. He has faced the silence and survived it. He has walked without direction and still found his path. That kind of inner strength cannot be taught. It can only be earned. There's also an honesty that emerges in solitude. When you're alone, there's no one to lie to. You can't hide behind excuses or pretend things are fine. You are forced to be brutally honest with yourself. And that kind of truth telling is the first step toward real transformation. You start to see your patterns clearly, the habits that are holding you back, the thoughts that are sabotaging your progress, the relationships that are draining your energy. You begin to see what needs to change, not because someone else told you, but because you've seen it for yourself, in your own silence. And when change comes from within, it's deeper, stronger, and longer-lasting solitude also enhances focus. Without the pull of constant conversations, notifications and opinions, your mind sharpens. You start to think more clearly, plan more strategically, and act more intentionally. Your energy is no longer dispersed trying to keep up with the world. It's directed like a laser at what actually matters. You start noticing the details that others miss, the patterns others overlook. You begin to see opportunities that aren't obvious to those distracted by the crowd. This is the competitive edge of solitude. It gives you the space to think differently, act boldly, and lead authentically. There's a sacredness in the solitude of purpose. When you walk alone, you begin to understand that not everyone is meant to walk with you. Some people won't understand your mission, your discipline, or your sacrifice, and that's okay. Chosen men are not defined by their popularity, but by their principles. They don't adjust their path to fit in. They stay the course, even when no one else walks beside them. Because the truth is, not everyone is supposed to get it. Not everyone will understand the fire inside you, but that fire doesn't burn for applause. It burns for impact, for purpose, for legacy, and in that fire, forged by solitude, a man becomes more than what the world expected of him. He becomes who he was meant to be. He stops chasing relevance and starts building substance. He stops reacting to trends and starts standing on truth. He becomes grounded, not in ego but in self-awareness. He becomes calm, not because life is easy but because he has learned to master himself. He becomes focused, not on external validation, but on internal alignment. These are not the traits of someone who needs the crowd. These are the hallmarks of a chosen man, refined by walking alone. You begin to trust yourself more. In solitude, your decisions are not swayed by peer pressure or public opinion. You learn to rely on your own judgment. You make mistakes, yes, but they are your own, and you learn from them deeply. You stop asking for permission and start acting with conviction. This builds a confidence that can't be faked. A quiet, steady belief in who you are and where you're going. And that belief is magnetic. People feel it even if they don't understand it, because there's a weight to someone who has walked through fire alone and come out stronger on the other side. Solitude doesn't make you cold. It makes you clear. It doesn't disconnect you from people. It helps you connect with the right people. When you know who you are, you no longer chase relationships to fill a void. You don't settle for shallow connections or surface-level conversations. You seek depth, alignment, and shared values. And in that search, you attract what you've become. That's why the man who walks alone often ends up leading others. Because people are drawn to clarity, to strength, to purpose. Not the loud kind, but the kind that doesn't waver when things get hard. You also start to see time differently. When you walk alone, you realize how precious your hours are. You stop wasting time on distractions, gossip, and empty pursuits. You start investing your time in growth, in mastery, in legacy. You realize that solitude is not an obstacle to success. It's a path to it. Because the time you spend alone is the time you spend building the foundation. The deeper the foundation, the taller the structure. And most of that foundational work happens in quiet, when no one is watching, and no one is clapping. You realize that being misunderstood is not a problem, it's a sign you're on a unique path. The man who chooses solitude over conformity, depth over popularity, vision over noise will not always be understood. But that's not a reason to stop, it's a reason to keep going. Because clarity doesn't come from being accepted, it comes from being aligned. When you're aligned with your values, your mission, and your higher self, confusion falls away. You stop overthinking and start executing. You stop second-guessing and start building. That's the gift of walking alone. You stop living by default and start living by design. In solitude, you also learn patience. You understand that not everything needs to happen now. You see the long game. You're not chasing quick wins, you're planting seeds. Seeds of discipline, seeds of character, seeds of vision. And because you've spent time in silence, you've learned how to wait, how to water those seeds, how to protect them from distractions and doubt. You know that growth isn't always visible, but it's always happening. And because of that, you don't panic in the dark. You don't give up in the winter. You've sat with silence before, and you know it often precedes breakthrough. The man who walks alone walks slower, maybe, but he walks straighter. His path is not swayed by trends or temptations. His direction is set by something internal, something enduring. And because of that, he arrives not only with success, but with soul. Not only with results, but with wisdom. Not only with achievements, but with authenticity. And in a world that's starving for something real, that kind of presence speaks louder than any noise. Here is the expanded version of the keynote. The man who walks alone learns to lead without followers, in approximately 1,400 words, written in a continuous motivational tone, without ending statements or headings. Leadership is often misunderstood. In most people's eyes, a leader is the one at the front of a crowd, the person being followed, praised, admired, and celebrated. They imagine leadership as a position, a spotlight, a platform. But true leadership doesn't begin in front of an audience. It begins in the shadows. It begins in the quiet, unrewarded, and often unnoticed decisions a man makes when no one else is around. It begins long before the first follower shows up. It begins when a man walks alone. Alone in his discipline. Alone in his standards. Alone in his sacrifice. He doesn't lead because people are behind him. He leads because he's willing to walk a path that others are not yet ready to walk. He leads because he goes first, even when there's no one watching. The man who walks alone doesn't wait for permission. He doesn't look over his shoulder for approval or applause. He knows that the most important paths are often walked in silence. He steps into unknown territory, not because he's trying to be seen, but because he refuses to stay stagnant. His leadership is rooted not in charisma, but in conviction, not in image, but in identity. He understands that leadership is not about being followed. It's about being forged, and forging happens in fire, in solitude, in the repetition of right choices when no one else sees the struggle, in the pain of growth that goes uncelebrated. That's where real leadership is born. You learn to lead without followers when you commit to something bigger than yourself. Not everyone will understand your path, and that's exactly the point. The leader is the one who goes ahead, who sees the mountain before anyone else, who starts climbing when everyone else is still sleeping. He doesn't need someone to validate his mission. His mission validates itself through his commitment. And when you're that committed, when your actions are aligned with a deeper purpose, you begin to walk differently. You carry weight with your silence. You inspire not through words, but through presence. That's what walking alone builds. It builds a gravity around you. A quiet authority that comes not from titles or followers, but from alignment. Walking alone strips away performance. You stop trying to look like a leader and start living like one. There's no one to impress, so everything becomes real. Your discipline is real. Your struggles are real. Your growth is real. You don't get to hide behind image, because there's no audience. And that's the training ground of authentic leadership, where consistency replaces showmanship, where character replaces charisma, where the private victories prepare you for public pressure. Because eventually, people do follow, but not because you ask them to. They follow because they sense something solid in you. Something grounded, something earned. The man who leads without followers doesn't lead to be followed. He leads because he can't do anything else. He sees what's possible, and he refuses to sit still. He knows what's right, and he refuses to compromise. That kind of leadership doesn't depend on recognition. It doesn't depend on applause. In fact, it grows stronger without it, because the fewer people watching, the purer the motive becomes. It's in solitude that your reasons are tested. When you continue even when no one claps, when you grind even when no one sees, when you keep showing up not because you're being cheered on, but because you made a vow to yourself. That's when you know you're becoming a leader. Leadership, without followers, is the ultimate test of integrity. It asks, who are you when no one's looking? What do you stand for when no one agrees with you? Will you keep your standards when they cost you approval, comfort, and companionship? Most people lead with a need to be needed. They seek control through influence. But the man who walks alone learns to let go of control. He leads not to manage others but to master himself. His leadership is an invitation, not a demand. His life becomes the message. His walk becomes the lesson. He leads by going deeper, not louder, and in that depth, something powerful happens. He becomes self-sufficient. Not in an arrogant way, but in a resilient way. He no longer depends on others to validate his worth or confirm his direction. He doesn't chase crowds or build personas. He is enough with or without attention. That inner sufficiency allows him to lead with clarity, because he's not swayed by opinion, not shaken by rejection, not addicted to affirmation. That kind of clarity is rare and people recognize it. Even if they can't explain it, they're drawn to it. They trust it. That's why the man who leads without followers eventually attracts followers. Not because he needs them, but because they need what he's become. There's a discipline that's only developed in solitude. When you walk alone, you are your own accountability. No one is checking in. No one is forcing you forward. That means every decision becomes a test of your will. Will you wake up early when no one knows? Will you train when there's no coach? Will you stay focused when there's no deadline? These are the questions that shape true leaders. Because if you can lead yourself, you can lead anything. But if you need a crowd to stay consistent, you're not a leader, you're a performer. Solitude makes sure you know the difference. In solitude, the leader's vision gets refined. Without the distractions of noise and comparison, he can see further. He can think deeper. He's not building based on trends. He's building based on truth. And that kind of vision doesn't come overnight. It comes through stillness, through struggle, through seasons of silence. It's in those quiet hours that conviction forms. You begin to see what matters, what lasts, what aligns with your principles. You start letting go of what's superficial and doubling down on what's meaningful. That vision becomes the compass, and it's so clear that you don't need external motivation to move. You're pulled by purpose. The man who walks alone learns how to be misunderstood. He learns how to keep walking when others mock him, question him, or leave him. Because leadership often looks like rebellion at first. When you choose discipline over indulgence, silence over noise and purpose over popularity, people won't get it, and they don't have to. The leader doesn't explain himself. He expresses himself through action. He knows time will speak on his behalf. And it always does. The seeds he plants in solitude grow roots that others never see. But one day they become trees. One day, people look up and realize, this man wasn't lost. He was ahead, and being ahead is lonely. That's part of the cost. You see things others don't. You feel things others avoid. You carry weight that most people drop. But in that weight your strength is built. In that loneliness your depth is formed. And in that depth your leadership becomes undeniable. Not flashy, not loud, but solid, steady, reliable. You become the man people turn to when everything else falls apart. Not because you asked to be that man, but because you became him when no one was looking. Walking alone also teaches you how to endure. It teaches you how to keep moving without constant encouragement. How to keep showing up when there's no feedback. It's easy to lead when there's momentum. When the team is behind you, when the results are showing, but real leadership is tested in draughts, in silence, in uncertainty. When everything slows down and you still keep going, that's when your leadership is proven. That's when you earn your own respect. And self-respect is the foundation of real influence. Because you can't expect others to believe in you if you haven't learned to believe in yourself. The man who walks alone also learns to think independently. He's not swayed by groupthink or peer pressure. He's not caught in the loop of imitation. He develops original thought, original strategies, original insight. That originality makes him dangerous in the best way. Because he's no longer reactive, he's intentional. He's not copying. He's creating. He's not following the market. He's shaping it. That's the kind of influence that leaves a mark. That's leadership that doesn't fade when trends change. It lasts because it's built on something real. Eventually, people notice. They see the consistency. they feel the depth. They recognize the results. And when they come to follow, they're not following a brand, they're following a man. A man who didn't need them to become who he is. A man who built in silence, stayed grounded in storms, and chose the hard road when easier ones were available. That kind of leader is rare, and that's why he's needed. Not because he has a million followers, but because he has one unwavering direction. Not because he pleases the crowd, but because he walks with conviction. That's the kind of leadership that changes things. That shapes culture. That defines eras, and all of it begins in solitude. All of it begins when a man chooses to walk alone, not to prove a point, not to make a scene, but because he knows that leadership isn't something you claim. It's something you become. Not when you're seen, but when you're tested. Not when you're followed, but when you're forged.